All right, I want to return to the topic of the riots in Los Angeles and the Trump administration's response. As we mentioned earlier, in addition to the National Guard, about a little over 4,000 National Guard members, the Trump administration last night authorized the deployment of around 700 U.S. Marines to the area. Now, most likely that's because the First Marine Division is actually not far from L.A. in Camp Pendleton. That's where I was at. According to an official statement, their deployment is meant to aid in protecting federal personnel and property. Here to discuss this is Ken Cuccinelli, former Attorney General for Virginia. He was also the acting Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security during the first Trump administration. He currently serves as a senior fellow for Homeland Security and Immigration for the Center for Renewing America. Ken, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Tony, as always.
All right, so a couple issues that you are kind of expert on here. Obviously, the immigration issue, what ICE is doing. You're very much involved in that in the first Trump administration. Talk a little bit about the what's happening in terms of removing illegals from the country.
So, of course, the excuse, and I refer to it in a diminishing way as calling it an excuse for a lot of this violence, is that ICE is just doing its job and removing people from LA who are present illegally in the United States. They were already doing that, and violence began around that before President Trump deployed or even announced he would deploy the National Guard. So, you're hearing from Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass now, well, none of this was a problem until he threw the National Guard in there like it's the gasoline on the fire. The fires were already burning in Los Angeles because of the violence that they had not quelled. And the police chief there had already talked about being overwhelmed. So the president used his authority to federalize, is the word, federalize the National Guard of California and put it under the president's control, taking it out from under the governor's control, and to deploy it to bring peace to the streets by backing up ICE and the other federal agents and officers who were under attack there. And then he's moved Marines into position to back that up further.
Let's stop with let's stop and talk about the National Guard first, because that's something that's been done before.
Yes.
And the president can take control of those state guard troops, and that's what the Guard is there for, is to deal with domestic issues. Where we come into kind of a rarity, not something that happens very often, is the next step that you were about to talk about, and that is deploying active duty Marines.
Right. Yes. Now, normally, if this were to happen, you'd expect it to be done under the Insurrection Act. There are a couple of other authorities. There's Military Cooperation Act that's available to help with planning, and they can use reconnaissance assets to help aid local law enforcement. They can provide equipment, and they can support that equipment for local law enforcement. But for direct engagement, you'd expect to see a proclamation from the president invoking the Insurrection Act. And I want to be clear to folks. It's called the Insurrection Act, and the media loves that name because it sounds so inflammatory. But insurrection is only one of the four bases on which the president can invoke the powers found in the Insurrection Act. Others are just illegal assemblies, conspiracies, and so forth. And we clearly have that going on here, where violence occurs and constitutional rights, including property rights, are impaired, and that we're way past that threshold in Los Angeles. So the president could, without any serious, at least not without a successful legal challenge, not to say people won't sue, just like the governor is sued over the National Guard, he's going to lose that case, and he would lose one under the Insurrection Act, because the president has that authority to utilize active duty military. You're right, Tony. We haven't seen this very much. We did see it in LA back when George Bush was president in 1992 in the King riots. However, that's a prudential or a political question. It's not a high legal threshold for the president. If the president decides that federal resources available are insufficient to accomplish the execution of federal law, like deportations by ICE agents, then he may use the Insurrection Act to supplement those forces. And in that situation, the U.S. Marines can make arrests. They can join the ICE agents in doing their job, as can the National Guard members. So that's hasn't happened yet, but that is something the president seems in his comments to be preparing America for. And by the way, I would note, Tony, he said he was going to do this in his campaign.
So let me ask you this question, Ken. If they are functioning as law enforcement, making arrests, detaining people, are they subjected to the same civil threshold of false arrest or abuse that a normal police officer working on the streets could face?
Yes. And here's where the fact that officers get training on that subject and Marines don't comes into play. So typically, when I was the acting deputy, we at least talked about this. We asked for this. We didn't get it in the first Trump administration, but we were planning through preparing people who had not engaged in this activity about how they could do it most safely and most effectively. So there are ways, of course, and you, of course, are a former Marine yourself, if there's any such thing as a former Marine. This is more in the realm of what National Guardsmen would be trained to do typically. Nonetheless, there are MPs that every branch has and so forth that also have the training.
Yeah, but it is different. I've been both a Marine and a police officer, and the domestic law enforcement training is a bit different. And there is always that concern over the civil liabilities, which sometimes in the military, when you're usually operating in a hostile environment elsewhere, it's not a big concern. By the way, this news just coming in. A judge has denied Gavin Newsom's request to stop Trump from using the National Guard. He filed suit a little bit earlier today. That has been turned down. Yeah, I think that's clear cut. But I want to dwell for just a moment on the military aspect of this. I think you're right. The only place I can see it in most recently was back in 1992, again in Los Angeles, a city that is very fragile and always seems like it's always burning. But here's my concern, all right? And you and I may disagree on this, but I had concerns over the Patriot Act that George Bush passed because I was afraid that it would be used by someone who didn't have the same standard that he had. And in fact, it was misused against Donald Trump himself and his campaign. My concern here is setting a new precedent and using U.S. military on U.S. soil and desensitizing the American people to the presence of the military. I'm concerned about what, a leftist administration could do with that.
Yeah, and I understand that, Tony. I was and still am concerned about the Patriot Act, and I have actually litigated to stop some of the abuses in that space. And, anytime we see, for example, things that Joe Biden did that Republicans complained about, but Democrats defended. Well, now when Donald Trump takes steps that look similar, the Democrats are hogtied. They were defending this before, and so now they see precedents used against them. And this can go both ways, as you wisely point out. And I think that's a very legitimate concern. I think we're at a situation in Los Angeles where we've seen days of violence. We've seen the president move National Guardsmen in, and it does, by the way, appear to be helping. It does appear to be bringing the level of violence down. It hasn't brought it down to zero, which Donald Trump has called for, but it has brought it down and, frankly, made it easier for the LAPD to regain control to the extent they put that effort in. So I think the deterrent threat is valuable, that a threshold of ongoing violence that can't be handled by the National Guard makes sense to me. But anytime a president does something this aggressive, the precedent can be used in other directions. You're absolutely right.
Well, I think just the threat of sending in the Marines was probably enough to make them all go home. But, you know, there's underlying issues here, Ken, and we don't have time to talk about it, but it's something that I think we would both agree that when you look at the whole fabric of society, the breakup of the family, lawlessness, and some of the elected leaders we have out there, it's just a matter of time before cities begin to burn when you have all those factors at play.
Well, not only that, you have elected officials virtually encouraging people to do this.
Yeah.
And look, remember, people, violence for political purposes is the very definition of terrorism. The fact that these aren't Muslims in Israel blowing themselves up doesn't make it any less terrorism. It's just lower level violence, but it's still terrorism.
Yeah.
And that is the point. And it's, I say funny, I mean that in an odd way, how Democrats are perfectly comfortable with their allies committing violence as long as it's in the right political direction. As we saw in 2020, when I was responsible for handling the logistics of trying to protect federal officers and property in cities across the country that were burning, where governors, for example, Governor Brown in Oregon, wouldn't use the National Guard. We had 340 officer injuries just in Portland, Oregon, in the summer of 2020. And Governor Brown wouldn't bring out the National Guard. And at that time, President Trump chose not to exercise his authority as president to do so. I wish he had. I asked him to do that. I'm pleased to see him doing it now. This is not an escalation by the president. This is the use of appropriate force to stop violence.
Yeah.
And that's an appropriate way to do it. And I also think it'll matter in other cities as we look at Seattle getting ready to go this route, and New York and others.
It's clear that he has learned from the first administration to move quickly and to show that force. Ken Cuccinelli, always great to see you. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Tony.